Protagonists are almost always the most crucial character in any story. They're the ones you'll spend the most time with, the ones we're meant to sympathise with, and the ones who'll drive the plot forward. In my opinion, silent protagonists are the worst thing you can do to get me invested in a story. I just can't put myself into the shoes of a socially awkward quiet boy. Not because I'm not a socially awkward quiet boy, but because everyone in the story seems to like the socially awkward quiet boy. They're just a blank canvas with no personality that I think has only been done right twice in history, Persona 5 and Wind Waker. But today's subject isn't a silent protagonist, but I wouldn't call him a full-fledged character either. Ethan Winters is the blandest protagonist I've seen in years, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Now, I didn't play Resident Evil 6, still I understand that one of the significant problems with that game was that every character in it was a goddamn superhero, and it was about as scary as a Marvel movie. With 7 being a toning down of the franchise, it made sense for the protagonist to be an average guy, but he's not just an average guy. Instead, he's a bread sandwich and glass of milk guy. He's a character with goals but no personality. In an open-world action-adventure game, this would be a huge knock against it, but here in Resident Evil, it works so well because it blends in with the silliness of the franchise. If you haven't figured it out by now, Resident Evil games are incredibly stupid and horrifying at the same time. I mean, Resident Evil 2 has this tight, dripping atmosphere, alongside a big man in a fedora and trench coat angrily stomping after you. It's a total lurching tone that, against all odds, works because it can still maintain its levels of fear throughout. How Ethan works in that setting is because he's such a non-character that the world is able to throw whatever scary idea the developers have, while never feeling like something out of place in a Resident Evil game. I mean, could you really see Chris as the protagonist of Village? Of course not, because he's such a badass he'd be out of there in 10 minutes. But Ethan's also enough of a character that it doesn't feel stupid that these villains are gloating at a piece of meat with no motivation. Speaking of those villains, the reason Jack Baker and Lady Dimitrescu have soared into the public eye as the marketing figures surrounding Resident Evil 7 and 8 is because Ethan is out of the way. I mean, look at the box art for 2 and 3 remakes. Again, the focus is on the protagonists, while in 7 and 8, the focus is on the world surrounding Ethan and the horrors he'll have to face. It's because of Ethan's meek personality that his adversaries shine so brightly, and Capcom knows this because every antagonist in these games is some larger-than-life erratic monster straight out of a JoJo manga. Ethan isn't supposed to be a character we're meant to relate to, despite him being such an everyman. He's a character we're meant to disconnect ourselves from, so we can see ourselves in his shoes. This is shown through his dialogue. He seldom talks unless he's in a conversation, and his lines are always short, direct, and to the point. He has the bare minimum amount of character needed to provide a narrative framework, while still allowing the player to disengage themselves from his struggles and make them think the goal is to escape from these nightmarish places. This is why we need to talk specifically about Resident Evil Village now. With 7 being a soft reboot of the franchise, it made sense to have a down-to-earth character for the player to control. 7 was a game with a claustrophobic, dark and disgusting atmosphere, where the game took place in a constrained environment, a small world to reflect a small protagonist. This is why keeping Ethan for Village was so curious. See, a complaint I have about Resident Evil Village is that they rushed back into the expansiveness that ultimately destroyed Resident Evil way too quickly. The environment is now huge, and the game was brightly lit and mostly set during the day. There were fantasy elements and a wide array of art styles that didn't all necessarily mesh well together. And while the Bakers were indeed lively and charismatic villains, they were no Heisenberg. So with such a huge step up from the last game in terms of scope and art, it felt so out of place to keep Ethan Winters as the protagonist, especially when he had no character arc from the last game. he still played the exact same way he did in Resident Evil 7. He hadn't become a badass like Leon did between Resident Evil 2 and 4. And his personality was still non-existent, but this time he was in a world unlike anything Resident Evil had ever seen. A world begging for some interaction. And if you've made it this far in the video, I'm going to spoil the ending of Resident Evil Village in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Killing Ethan was the only thing left for his character. You couldn't have him be the protagonist for the next game, because you'll have to do a bigger and better thing than Village, or else you'll have to soft reboot again, in which case you can't keep Ethan as the protagonist. Throughout 2 full Resident Evil games, his character hadn't grown significantly, so it was clear he was never going to, and if you put Ethan into a bigger world than the one in Resident Evil Village, it would be a step too far, and the entire narrative framework that Capcom worked so hard on would fall apart. Ethan Winters is one of the most boring protagonists I've ever played as, and that does wonders for the games he's in. It allows the true stars to shine while still fitting nicely into the world of Resident Evil, and while it was time for him to go, I'm really going to miss him.